This week on Life and Faith.
The whole thing was a very surreal experience. I guess that's the word I've used more often than any other. Watching houses burn and being in what should be broad daylight when it just feels like the middle of the night, except that it's orange and very smoky for days.
We have entered into an amusing ourselves to death moment in history.
It doesn't make sense to me. If there is God, God's supposed to be free.
I was 100% sure that I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only chance for happiness in this world.
Miracles don't necessarily change anybody's mind. They just get their attention.
And so I had to run with my child on my back, the ESA army coming behind us.
I said, gee, Uncle George, this is luxurious for a communist. Son, he said, nothing's too good for the worker, nothing.
This is Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Well, there's been one story that's really dominated the summer, at least in Australia. And it wasn't impeachment or coronavirus. It has been one of the worst bushfire seasons we've ever had.
The terrifying scale of Australia's bushfire disaster is beginning to emerge.
As the year and the decade comes to an end, the country is burning. It's been labelled the worst fire season ever recorded.
In New South Wales alone, almost 5 million hectares have burned. That's an area larger than the Netherlands. In total, the fires have so far burned out around 12 million hectares. That's almost the size of England. To put that in perspective, the horrific Amazon fires last year destroyed around 900,000 hectares. Even for people who haven't been directly affected, it's been a weird, smoky summer for those living in Australian cities. The smoke became so thick that Melbourne and Canberra at times topped the charts for the world's worst air quality. And NASA declared the smoke had travelled halfway around the world to South America and was due to make a complete circuit back to Australia.
And of course, Natasha, those numbers and the satellite images don't begin to capture the personal losses. And there's been an enormous amount of this. At least 29 people have died. Thousands of homes and buildings have been lost. And there are some estimates that say more than 1 billion animals have died. I don't know how you count something like that, but the scale of this is just so devastating. And there's been a lot of emotion, reactions to everything that's been happening, obviously a lot of mourning and fear. Also solidarity, people rising to the challenge. There's been anger and recriminations as we argue with each other about our response as a country to the effects of climate change, for instance.
Yeah, and there are a lot of conversations to be had here. In this episode, we just wanted to give some space to some voices. The voices of ordinary people, some of them volunteers, some just in the wrong place at the wrong time, you might say, to bring you a few little snapshots of how this very big crisis has played out for some individuals and communities.
I had an interesting summer, and it goes on. I'll tell you the very end of my summer. Mm-hmm. I still am missing 3 of our family cars. They're locked up in Mallacoota in the far east of Victoria.
That's a lot of family cars.
Yes, it is actually. Well,
you have a big family.
Lindy has one and I have one and one of my sons has one, and those 3 cars are in Mallacoota.
Good evening. It's been described as hell on earth. In Mallacoota, 4,000 locals and tourists have been forced to huddle on the waterfront to survive the inferno raging around them. Blake Johnson begins our coverage.
No sunlight, just smoke and flames everywhere.
A few days after Christmas, Chris Mulherin is driving from Melbourne to Mallacoota. Now, Mallacoota is a place that, if you'd never heard of it before this summer, well, every Australian has heard of it now. Over New Year's, it was smack bang in the middle of one of the biggest fires.
Chris is an Anglican minister. He runs a group called ISCAST. It's for Christians in Science in Australia. He teaches philosophy, and he's a friend of CPX. He and his wife are part of a team of people who go every year to Mallacoota with an organisation called Scripture Union. Over the summer, the population of Mallacoota goes from about 1,000 to closer to 10,000. And Chris and the team run a kind of youth drop-in centre for a couple of weeks for local kids as well as for the tourists.
We arrived in Mallacoota on the 28th, as we always do. We drove through part of fire-affected Victoria near Bruton, which is, the fire was a long way from Mallacoota and there was no danger in Mallacoota or warnings about Mallacoota at that stage. But then the next day a fire started much closer to Mallacoota at Wingan River, and Mallacoota started getting warnings, at which point it was too late to leave.
The fire was expected to arrive early in the morning on the 31st, New Year's Eve, and the team needed to figure out their plan.
Well, we know there's a fire coming. We know that the mud brick hall is on the edge of the oval, and across the oval is the refuge, the designated refuge, which is the cinema, and then just a bit further away, 100 metres from the cinema, is the water. So we're not in a dense bushy area, although there's dense bush all around Mallacoota. We know what we're going to do. The community meeting, the CFA has said, when you hear sirens, it's time to take the designated action, and our action was to go to the refuge. So we were prepared for that. We had a wheelie bin full of wet blankets, because one of the problems with fires is embers or radiant heat. We had wet tea towels as face masks, that sort of thing, prepared to walk across the oval when we had to.
At 5 a.m, there's no power and no phone service. The team has breakfast, they all put on the tea towels and head across to the cinema. They settle in there with about 600 other people.
The refuge was very hot, it was very smoky, and there was no power. Outside we heard what was going on, we can hear the wind, the occasional glances through the door. The sun should have been rising, but it looked like nighttime, but very, very orange, smoky and orange. At one stage, a number of us heard dull thud explosions in the distance, and those of us who knew what they were gas bottles, houses, so symbolising, you know, another house had just gone up, sort of thing. So we knew that the fire was in town.
It was a long day for those 600 people. Chris and the team spend their time entertaining themselves and others. There are movies for the kids. People pass the time talking or sleeping or eating or walking around with spray bottles to help cool people down.
I guess the most worrying time for me in the refuge was when I was in the first aid station and the CFA person in charge came in to speak to the first aid people and said, look, this isn't likely to happen, but if we can't protect this building, you'll need to go through that door down to the water. Right, you've got 600 people, lots of children, lots of stressed people, lots of older people who can't move very well, and that door was about a metre wide. That was not going to be a pretty sight if they said to evacuate the building. At which point I went back to the team and we talked amongst the team about what we were going to do, because if we went down to the water, there's a deep stretch of water before a sandbar, and we had to work out how to get across the deep stretch of water, and not all the team could swim very well. So who was going to stand in the deep stretch of water and help the others across to the sandbar, and you know, those sort of scenarios that you work out that we never had to use, fortunately. About 11, 12 o'clock that day, we went outside, and it could have been the middle of the night. The fire had passed Mallacoota, but it was still burning in lots of places. We went down to the wharf, and across the water from the wharf, 200 metres, another stretch of land with houses on it, and we watched houses burning and the bush burning. So began the aftermath, which for the team was 3 days, and for Lindy and I was about another 10 days in Mallacoota.
What are your emotions like at that point, watching people's houses go up? I mean, they're not your houses.
No, it's the whole thing was a very surreal experience. I guess that's the word I've used more often than any other. Watching houses burn and being in what should be broad daylight when it just feels like the middle of the night, except that it's orange and very smoky for days.
After the fire itself is under control, Chris and his team need to make the decision of whether to stay or go. If they can be useful, they want to stick around, but they also don't want to be in the way. The roads are impassable, and the Navy gets called in to evacuate people from the beach. On the 2nd of January, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, declares a state of disaster. It's the first ever such declaration for Victoria, and the team reluctantly decide it's time to go. They pack everything up, and on the afternoon of the 3rd are the last ones on board the HMAS Choules heading back to Melbourne.
I think the crew of the Choules were very happy to be looking after civilians. They were told they could have the run of the boat, not to go through any locked doors, apart from that. So they were on the bridge and they explored the whole ship. Ship, not boat, sorry. Navy people listening.
Chris and his wife Lindy, though, consult with locals about what would be most helpful and decide to stay in Mallacoota.
So in keeping with this being the disaster episode, we had a number of recording issues in this interview. Phones ringing, some kind of heavy machinery starting, and, of course, a fire alarm. Bear with us.
Lindy worked in the op shop a couple of days. We met people on the street and said, the classic conversation that I had a number of times was, how you doing? Okay. Are you a local? Yes. How's your house? And then they would say, fine, not touched. Or they would say, I lost everything.
How do you respond at that point?
Yeah, I'm responding now. I'm a bit teary. When someone says to you, I lost everything, what do you do? You tear up. You put your hand on their shoulder. You don't say, oh, well, that's okay, God loves you. There's really not many words. So I think that probably, silence, the hand on the shoulder is... There's the fire alarm, I think. How appropriate.
Among the many other hats he wears, Chris is a chaplain. So he was really in a position to notice the spiritual element in people's responses to what happened.
There's no doubt that disaster or adversity, a common enemy, can bind people together. And in the immediate time, everybody is just a human being, a fellow human being going through this stuff, and fellow other animals. So all animals are bound together against this common sort of enemy, and people look after each other and do what needs to be done. They share, they give things away, they say, don't worry about paying for it, or, and that's a good thing to see, and you see that right across the country, people being very generous and being selfless, if you like. The other side of it is it raises theological questions. So for me, some people knew why we were in town. We were in town with a Christian group, and one person came up to me. She'd had a couple of drinks, so she was a little bit more relaxed than usual. We knew her a bit, we didn't know her well. A local said, where was your God in this? Where is God? How can God let this happen? And once again, it's not the sort of thing that you launch into a philosophical argument about. I teach philosophy, and one of the classes, I do a 3-hour class quite often on the problem of evil. But I always start my class by saying the problem of evil is first and foremost a pastoral problem. And there you have it. I mean, she was raising the problem of evil. If God is good, how can this happen? And it's not the time for philosophical meanderings about the problem of evil. It's just the time to put your hand on their shoulder and say, look, that is a very difficult question. But she was very angry. She was angry at God. She was probably angry at the God she didn't believe in. Another experience that we had was I was standing behind a woman in the fish and chip shop 2 or 3 days after the fire, and she was at the counter, and she said to the people at the counter, well, I made promises to God. I said to God, whatever you like, as long as you spare my house. Well, he did spare my house, and I hope he doesn't come to collect. And then she turned around, and I had my name, and it said under my name, chaplain, in large letters. And she turned around, and I smiled and said, he's come to collect. And she laughed and said, oh no. So, again, probably somebody who had either didn't believe in God or had no sort of commitment to God in any way, but when push comes to shove, she'd said her prayers and said, help, save my house. And again, that's a very human thing. It reminds me of
The road into Mallacoota didn't open until February, more than a month after the fire. Chris and Lindy eventually left courtesy of the Air Force. As a one-time engineer, Chris asked if they could hitch a ride on a Chinook helicopter that was heading out. So that was a bit of a silver lining for him.
Lindy and I were the only people on this Chinook going back to Sale. They left the tailgate open, so we basically looked at the Gippsland coast, miles and miles and miles of burnt coast. It was impressive in a sort of negative way. And we enjoyed our ride in the Chinook.
Was it as cool an experience as you hoped?
Well, it was very cool. And in fact, one of the Air Force guys, I said, have you been on a Chinook? No, I've never been on a Chinook. and then there was a bit of a spar there too. I said, well, it's better than a fixed wing plane, isn't it? And he looked at me and I suddenly realised the Chinooks actually belong to the Army and the fixed wing planes belong to the Air Force. So
I've been up in Queensland in September when they were having fires on the Gold Coast hinterland. I went up there for a weekend. We were doing what we call property protection, which is where you're stationed on a house and you're waiting for a fire to come and you're protecting the house. In November, spent a day, it was a night shift really, overnight, doing backburning in Windsor. And then on Christmas Day, actually, was doing some more cleanup work in Bilpin, up in the mountains. And then earlier this year, I think
This is Benjamin North. He's currently finishing off an engineering degree. He's in the middle of an internship, and he's a volunteer with the RFS, the Rural Fire Service.
RFS is an acronym that we've been hearing a lot this summer.
Yes, we have.
Maybe everybody but me was clear already on what it means to be an RFS volunteer, but I wanted to get more of an idea of what's involved. Also, I should say here, Ben wanted to be clear that he doesn't speak for the RFS. This is just his personal experience and perspective.
So for what it means at my brigade, which is different to other brigades, is we have training and a meeting about every 2 weeks, all throughout the year. There's training courses on how to deal with car accidents or house fires or how to do bushfire fighting. And in terms of how I got started, it wasn't an intentional decision of mine, really. I had a friend at the time. I was in year 10 at school, and I knew this guy through church, actually, and his dad was running a cadets program at the local brigade. And my friend Adrian asked me if I wanted to come and join, so I thought, okay, yeah, give it a crack. That was a program run for people who were below the joining age, which is 16. And so I was a part of that for about a year. And then I did the first course, the bushfire fighting course, which then enables you to join the brigade. When I was 16. So I joined, and I've been part of it ever since then.
So Benjamin's done a lot of training, and this summer he's had a chance to put some more of that into practice. Unlike full-time firefighters, he's going about his normal life during all this, but then getting called out to different places for a day or a few days at a time. So what he gets are some glimpses into the bigger picture of what this particularly horrendous bushfire season has been like.
So I suppose I've just seen the aftermath of some of these huge fires. There have been a couple of points that have stuck with me. One of them has been, we were down in the Southern Highlands just earlier this year, and the fire had gone through a few days prior, and we were in this open sort of field, so there weren't as many of tall trees, but there were these smaller bushes, and they had leaves on them. The leaves were still there, but all of the leaves and the bushes themselves were frozen in this position. It looked like wind was blowing on them constantly to push them one way, but there was no wind. The fire had come through so hot, and either the wind created by the fire as the fire sucked oxygen, or the wind blowing on that day had blown these bushes into that position, and then the fire with its heat had frozen them like that. It was, I guess, beautiful in some sense, but also frightening to imagine the heat of a fire of that size.
I know it's a little bit arbitrary, but when Benjamin told us about the different stints he's been doing in Queensland and then various places in New South Wales, the story that got me was, hang on, you gave up your Christmas Day?
Yeah, that was, it's easy to say that I gave it up, but that was really, I guess, my family saying that it was okay for me to do that. in my small part that I had to play, I saw a need, and I saw that other people in my brigade have young families, and I thought, actually, like, this is easier for me to give this up today. And it was actually it was a surreal day in a sense that we went to this staging area where we're told what we're going to do for the day, and that was at a local high school. I was not expecting this at all. What we might normally get at the start of the day is food for the day, or and the briefing, but the food that we were presented with was this huge Christmas breakfast. So they had all these volunteers, I think from this high school or in the area, these residents who loved that we were there helping. They were serving like hams and probably turkey and chicken and all this food. I mean, I just had my Weet-Bix about an hour earlier, so I wasn't very hungry. But I had like a few potatoes because I wanted to say thank you. So it was this weird, like it was a wonderful gift to have all this food. And then they were giving us these Christmas presents as well to then give to our families when we got home to thank them for us being able to go out. And we said hi to the Premier and hi to the Fire Commissioner and got on ABC News. But it was a crazy day. It was, a wonderful Christmas day, but I don't think it'll happen again.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, let's hope not.
In January, the Governor-General put out a call for Australian Defence to be involved in helping with the bushfires that have been happening. I got a phone call asking whether I'd be willing to be one of the chaplains involved in supporting our troops in that operation. So I'm currently in the Adelaide Hills looking after the teams who are involved with the recovery down here.
Michelle Philp is a chaplain with the Air Force.
The teams Michelle's been supporting are doing things like cutting down trees that have fallen across roadways, providing water, clearing the ground, the early emergency stages of making the area safe so recovery can begin. Her main role is to be there for the troops as they do what can be quite intense work, seeing lots of destruction and also getting alongside residents as they process their trauma and grief. And those are conversations Michelle is having a lot as well.
Yeah, when I first arrived here in the middle of January, about 2.5, nearly 3 weeks ago now, driving along some of the roads, it was very eerie. You'd have burnt out trees on both sides of the road. So everything was just sort of that burnt black orange hazy kind of feel, and it was just so quiet because there's no rustling of the leaves, there's no animals in the trees. It was very eerie. 2.5 weeks on, things are starting to return. We've had some rain down here. You see little bits of grass starting to shoot up in some of the fields. Some of the trees are starting to get little sprouts back on them. Some of the birds have returned. Even saw 2 koalas in the trees the other day. And then I often also ask them stories about how they came to be living there. The Adelaide Hills is a beautiful place that a lot of people come to in the early stages of retirement, I guess, or for a particular lifestyle because it's usually so beautiful and green. You know, people have different stories of why they've come to live here, and they share those. But that's also then the thing that they've lost. It's not just the material possessions, but that loss of lifestyle. One lady said that to me, that philosophically she was able to say it's just a house, but emotionally it's not just a house. It's here's where I sat to write, here's where I sat to paint, here's where I sat to think through life, and that the view in front of them is now gone as well. I met one really interesting couple out at their property. So one of our teams had turned up there, and when they saw the devastation of this particular site, so a house was burnt down plus art studios and what had obviously been a beautiful garden, the whole place completely black. The team on the ground asked for a chaplain to come in. And so I came in and met with the owners at their site and got talking to them again, those same kind of questions about, you know, how they came to be living there. The male owner of the house, he was telling me he's an 81-year-old man. He's Hungarian. Was in a concentration camp at the age of 4 and had been badly abused. And so he was so afraid of people in uniform. He said normally if he saw people in uniform down the street, he would cross the road, walk away from them, But then he'd had to go into that recovery centre and sit in front of people in uniform to tell them why he needed their help. And at the end, he said he was quite jittery throughout that conversation. And when he got to the end of the conversation, though, the jitters had eased. And then he and his wife went to the local bakery and they saw two soldiers in uniform in having lunch. And he said, normally I would have gone and sat at the other side of the bakery, but I thought no. And so he went and sat at the table next to them. And then the next day, which was the day I was meeting them, they were there on their property with a team of soldiers helping them. And and that sort of changed his views quite a bit about people in uniform. And throughout that conversation, he was sharing with me about his spirituality and his spiritual journey through those years of living in Europe and exploring Buddhism. And for a brief period of time, he tells me he was a Benedictine monk, and he'd been exploring a lot about spirituality. And in all that, he said he's been looking for compassion and kindness in the world. And I asked him whether he'd ever read about the life of Jesus, who I think is one of the kindest, most compassionate people. I think Jesus is the person who's taught most about compassion amongst all the philosophers and different religions that have existed. And I asked him whether he'd ever read the life of Jesus. And he said he'd had connection with the church, obviously, with the connection with being a Benedictine monk, but he'd never read anything in the New Testament for himself, or read much of the New Testament for himself. And so the next day I took him up one of our Bibles that has the army camouflage uniform part on it and the New Testament inside, and gave him the connection both to overcoming his fear of uniforms and his fear of, well, not fear of, but, not having come across much of Jesus before in one book. And so he even hugged me, a woman in uniform.
Aww.
Yeah.
Now, Michelle's a Christian chaplain, so it's natural that she's reading this whole experience through the lens of her faith in Jesus.
At the beginning of this year, people kept asking me, so I was up at a Christian camp, and people kept asking me, so what are your plans for this year? I said, actually, I haven't made any plans. I think I'm just going to wait and see what God has in store. Mm-hmm. And less than a week after that, I was suddenly in the Adelaide Hills and serving as a chaplain in Defence. So normally I'm a day a week as a chaplain with Defence, 4 days a week with my church. But this meant coming down here full time. It's just been a wonderful opportunity to serve. The Chief of Army said a few weeks ago that helping others is what the Army does. Helping others is what we do in Defence. Getting to do it for Australians is a great honour. And I think that has been really true. It has just been a great honour to be able to help fellow Australians in this time of difficulty and time of tragedy, and to be someone who is able to be that calm presence because of the hope of Jesus. Just being fully aware of how much Jesus loved people during his time on earth, the time of, as I read through the Gospels and I see the way that Jesus interacted with people going through really hard times, and the compassion and the kindness that he showed, that's what I aim to do as I meet with people. Being that calm and listening ear at a time where people are going through tragedy and difficulty. One of the verses I've been reflecting on a lot is the verse where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And that's been my prayer for the people of the Adelaide Hills, is that they will come to find rest in Jesus in amongst all their burdens and weariness, as they're dealing with the bushfires.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Natasha Moore. And a huge thank you to Benjamin North, Chris Mulherin and Michelle Philp. We're really grateful to them for sharing their stories today.
Yeah, they all really wanted to acknowledge those who are on the front lines of this even more than they've been. Those who are fighting fires day in, day out. Also people who've lost homes, even family members. We want to acknowledge and honour them as well in these kind of snapshots of the suffering and the strength that we've seen in Australian communities across this bushfire season.
There are images that these three have sent us of what they've been seeing, and you can check these out at the Centre for Public Christianity Facebook feed. And do share this episode with others who you think would want to hear these stories. And if you'd like to donate to the recovery effort, we'll put some links in the show notes. Next week.
So I called the police myself, the police chief in Mumbai. I said, she's leaving with a trafficker, and you're not here. And if we lose her, we may never find her again. He said, I'm 20 minutes away. I give you the authority to stop that vehicle and take them into custody. I said, you understand, I'm not even a citizen of your country. And he said, that's okay, I give you the authority. And I actually just hung up the phone then because I didn't want him to take it back, realizing what he had done.